think that working on the non-electoral politics is the most important task. Because I don't think that the electoral politics would really help us do the work we need to do until we've really developed an engaged citizenry in our society that's working on a great variety of fronts from the angle of nonviolent struggle. The politics of nonviolent struggle, in my judgment, helps to produce people like John Lewis. And we have to produce more people like that. We're not going to get that, I think, within electoral politics. I think we're going to get that mostly from, I'm not trying to be dogmatic about this. We're going to get that more from doing the community work, parallel institutions, campaigns that make a little bit of change and incremental change after incremental change. That then produces the John Lewises that begin to supplant, in the long run, supplant electoral politics that is mostly career and power politics. Now, challenge me if that doesn't make any kind of sense. That electoral politics has produced, for me, people like Eleanor Roosevelt, in spite of all his faults, Lyndon Johnson, in spite of all his faults, and Robert Kennedy, John Kennedy. I think there are many others, but electoral politics has not really produced the vision that allows elected officials to see themselves as agents for change. That's part of the problem. We, the people, are far more advanced in our analysis of our own situations and the situations of other people than are the people who are, for the most part, in Congress. Local politics may be a little bit better, but I personally have spent my own time in the last 20 years doing much more teaching and consulting, because I think to raise up the nonviolent community of struggle is the most important task for the movements that we need in the 21st century. I do not give my attention that much to electoral politics, which I think is one of the problems. The number one political problem, in my judgment, for the Democratic Party is the Democratic Party must face up to the fact that it has betrayed its constituency. We who voted that way for years. That is a very long record for at least the last 10 presidential elections. The Jewish, the Black, the Hispanic, the Asian, the Indian communities have voted against the Republican candidate, no matter who it was. That's not because we have thought that the Democratic candidate was airless or that much better, but we knew we had no future with the Republican candidates. So that's why we went in 70, 80, 90 percentile in those 5 communities against the Republican candidate. And we've done that for 10, at least 10 of the last presidential elections. In other words, these 5 groups have been among the most aggrieved groups in the United States. Jewish community is still terribly afraid of the anti-Semitism, which we Christians started. They are not completely confident at all that it will never happen again. And Jewish hostile crimes tend to be second to black hostile crimes in the reporting of those groups that keep that figure in their work and study. Jewish anti-Semitic things have tended to be in many parts of the country second to anti-black hostile micro hostilities. That has variations across the nation in the last 30 or 40 years, but fundamentally, anti-Semitism has been the second largest hostile thing done next to anti-black. So the Jewish community remains on edge about this. So these 5 communities have experienced the lack of hospitality. We have not been invited in fully to be a part of a democratic process in society. And prohibitions have been laid upon us over and over again. Restrictions have been placed on us. The only other community that restrictions have been laid upon is the white poverty community, which has very few voices wanting to eradicate poverty. But you can say these 6 communities have always felt the inhospitality on the USA scene. Presidential elections, the 5 communities, statistically those stats are available. We have voted against the Republican because the Republicans have not offered us a candidate that we thought would be conscientious in trying to do something that has to be done. We're not sure about the Democratic candidate.
Sir,
Yes.
it's your platform, and you seem to be challenging me in a way. I don't know, it's just me. I have been a part of the white Democratic Party, okay? Because I'm white. But we've had affirmative action that's really expanded the whole outreach of the Democratic.
Well, now, I'm not ferreting you out.
I realize that, but
Because I look around to see
I
the.
feel a need to speak out to that because I was an elected delegate to a national convention that brought about an affirmative action program for the National Party. And I voted for that despite the fact that the local labor organization tried to offer me enticements not to vote for it at the time. But labor and the Democratic Party in California has been strongly supportive of many things that are been very good for working class people.
All right, let me give you my own analysis of this. The International Labor Unions, AFL-CIO executive committees, that includes the presidents of the unions and all, has tended to be a white male-dominated agency. So while they, AFL-CIO, lobbied for bills of health, anti-poverty, civil rights bills of the 60s and all, they lobbied for them nationally, as did national church bodies, Jewish, Protestant, Christian. National business bodies never lobbied for those measures. You can go study this yourself. Chamber of Commerce has been anti-union, anti-civil rights. If you look in the 60s, what I've said about national church bodies is true. AFL-CIO is true. Some, like the American Association of University Women, supported these things, but business, national organizations did not. At the local and the national level, the battle in the labor movement for full access for women, for full access for people of color, for democratic community unions committed to social justice for all, rather than business unions, that's the major issue. The national Washington level has been too much of a part of the establishment political economic. And I've watched that. I mean, the AFL-CIO for many years in the 50s supported the Cold War. Did not support the Organization of Unions in South Africa. Did not protest U.S. policy of assassination of union leaders in Southeast Asia, Central America. Did not. That's how bad it was. That's why the culture is such a powerful force in this country. See.
So I went to Washington to lobby with Glenn Anderson, my member of Congress, former lieutenant governor, on Central America. And even though I helped to get him elected, I didn't make any progress at all. So there's an example for you.
Yes, I know what you're saying. I went to a national convention.
Party as a candidate for Edward Kennedy from LA. So I have participated from time to time. So I'm not opposing any of that. I'm just simply saying that the organizations of congregations that are rooted in new life, transformation of life, transformation of injustice is our more urgent task. That's why I remained a pastor for 40-some years. The task of unions that become deeply enmeshed in their lives of their local people is our major task. That's my point of view. The development of campaigns that use nonviolent strategy and thinking, propaganda, and methodology in handling conflictive scenes in our local communities, that I think is my task. I think that to be our major task for all people who know that we can have a better LA, better local community, better nation. That, it seems to me, is our major work, because that work does have the power to ultimately change the national establishments that seem to be for war and an economy of war, organized war, and the rest of it. So I'm selective in what I feel I should use my own life for. And it might be helpful for you to understand that the nonviolent movement of America, as John Lewis and others have called what we were doing in those years, did produce progressive legislation for the country. But that was because we persuaded a president to get out of his comfort zone and do battle against what he knew was going on. So John Kennedy entered office without an awareness of the civil rights thing, but came to see very clearly the limitations put upon some people in our country, black people in particular, and began to align himself up with that. I think his support of the Washington March and his support of a far-reaching Civil Rights Bill of 1963, which he proposed, which became the 64 bill, was a part of the reason he was assassinated. I don't think it was only, if not primarily, over international affairs. I think it was because Robert Kennedy and John Kennedy in the administration, John Kennedy became the first president that I know of who went after big business, negotiating with them, calling them up to say, you are involved in the Birmingham campaign, so why don't you get in there and do something to help the desegregation of the city? You know it's wrong. He did that to Big Steel, and I don't know how many others, and I don't know if that story has been written about. Well, that's, here we are in Birmingham carrying on a campaign to desegregate the city. Big Steel is one of the big entities. John Kennedy goes so far as to use his office to call the presidents of Big Steel to say, you ought to be involved in the negotiations. You should be pushing your local operators in joining the effort to pull the signs down to negotiate a different kind of government. Well, that was unheard of. On the issue of race, who had ever done that? Roosevelt had never done that I know of. That's right. Yeah, I don't think he ever did. Eleanor may have wanted him to do it from time to time, but he never did it that I know of.
Very quickly on that.
Yeah.
I heard it said too that Dr. King was assassinated after announcing the court was marching by all this 6 opposed to just the 5 groups. I'm curious about your thoughts on that. Is there any truth to that, or if that's
Pepper, the last lawyer who did independent investigation and concluded that independent investigation, is the best authority in his books. He's got 3 books out, one just published maybe early part of this year, late part of last year. The King assassination has been solved. We know that James Earl Ray, beyond the shadow of doubt to a moral certainty, did not make the plot, did not shoot the rifle in Memphis on April the 4th, 1968. The CIA and the FBI official stories say he did. The congressional investigation says that it was a conspiracy, but they do not name anyone besides James Earl Ray. James Earl Ray did not do the shooting. And I can testify that because I became his pastor while he was in jail. Did his funeral service. I visited him in a pastoral call when he was very, very sick on more than one occasion, and visited him just a few days before his death. He was not a racist. That's the plain motive that the FBI has pinned on him. He was not a racist.
you became his pastor?
But yeah, I became his pastor, yeah. I married him while he was in prison, huh?
Am I wrong that you were there that
Beg
day?
pardon?
You were there that day? Am I wrong in that? When Dr. King was assassinated?
Yes, I was in Memphis. I was a major person,
Yeah.
strategist for the strike.
And then you became the pastor of the man accused of...
Yeah.
Wow.
It became clear to me. Well, I will say to you that my theology at that point does stand in the prophetic tradition of Jesus. There were too many questions on in the assassination that puzzled me. So I suspected we would not get a good investigation. James Earl Ray was tortured into pleading guilty. The same kind of torture that Senator McCain had during the Vietnam War, was it? That the Geneva Accords calls torture. They used on James Earl Ray in the Memphis jail. My regret is that I never, as a pastor in the city at that time, had the gumption to go down to visit him and challenge the sheriff about what they were doing to him, which I read about in the papers. I should have immediately moved personally to intervene, but they tortured him in the jail with 24-hour lights and 24-hour surveillance. So he did eventually plead guilty. He never had a trial. So that case, to my satisfaction and to the King's family satisfaction, has been resolved. Coretta King sued one of the plotters in Memphis in the late 1990s with William Pepper as her lawyer, sued a businessman for $100 and won the civil suit. She sued because she wanted a court transcript on that assassination that had the official and unofficial investigation under examination in the courtroom. That transcript is available. It's called The 13th Juror. It's maybe 1,000 pages or so. So that's what Coretta King wanted to happen. So she has that transcript available to us. So that case has been solved. I know beyond a shadow of doubt that that assassination was a deliberate assassination. And I suspect that the CIA and the FBI and the local police and perhaps military intelligence was in on that assassination. All four of those groups were present in Memphis on the day of assassination. Military intelligence, FBI, CIA. The evidence of that is clear. So I know that assassination.
So did you say, is it William Pepper who wrote?
William Pepper has produced 3 books now on the independent investigation that has a conversation with the official investigation and shows up the questions that they never answered. I'll give you one example of that only. On the day of assassination, April the 4th, King was on the balcony in the 2nd floor of the motel, Lorraine Motel. Jesse Jackson is there on the ground at that time. So are maybe 10, 15 people, including Andrew Young, who then becomes the UN ambassador under the Carter administration. Those people were not interrogated about what they saw, what they heard. They all saw smoke and figure in the weeds. Let's say that this is a rooming house facing the Lorraine Hotel. The rooming house goes like this, a whole series of buildings. The FBI says the shot came from the 2nd floor window bathroom over here. They, plus a number of other people in the immediate community here, in this block, in this street, in this block, at least one witness who heard the shot, ran to the corner, saw a man coming out of the weeds here and down the wall, down the street, and getting into a car and driving off. Any number of these people were never interrogated. A New York Times reporter by the name of Caldwell on the 2nd floor balcony saw the smoke over here. Official report says the shot came from this area instead of from this hillside. These people were never interrogated. So the official story was the shot came from the rooming house. 2nd floor over here. I'm reading a film script right now called To Slay the Dreamer. Producers, they've gotten some producers in there talking about it, so I was asked to read the script. They claimed the assassin shot from the rooming house, ran down the steps, threw the gun down in a blanket or something on the cement, and then escaped either up or down South Main Street. That's the official claim. They discovered that a woman by the name of Grace Walden had her door open, and as this man came down from the staircase of the second floor in the rooming house, she saw the man. They take a picture of James Earl Ray to identify as a person. She refuses to identify that person as, she says that's not the person, and I will not lie about the person I saw. She ends up in a mental hospital in West Tennessee. The story is about how she got out. So there's just a lot of stuff there.
Sorry to keep pressing on.
Yeah, go ahead.
Your opinion, it's always been something that I've wondered about, read about,
Yeah.
heard about. This was sort of the final straw that the CIA said this is enough, we have to shut him down.
No, I think the final straw was April
1967, the Beyond Vietnam speech. He had not engaged in a public criticism of the Vietnam War and the policies and what lies behind it. He did make a speech like that before the Nation Institute in LA, as I recall, maybe. But he declined to do this. I know this from our conversations all across 65, 66, 67, face to face, where we discuss these matters steadily. My point of view to him when we talked about these matters was that you have to decide, because you are the icon, you are the symbol of our struggle. You've been the chief person who raised it up. You've been the person who's been a major strategist. You must be the one to decide when you will speak out. He did it April the 4th, 1967. He refused to do it up to that time. I know that personally. So in refusing to do it, he did it. It's from that time on that the FBI and others decided he was the most dangerous person in the country and they had to get rid of him. So that's my thesis from following it.
I have a confession. Before the break, I broke up a conversation between you and Steve, so we could have a little break. And I want to give Steve a chance to follow up on that, because I'm guilty of breaking up that conversation. And then my wife also has a question she'd like to ask. Steve, would you bring that up again so I don't really lose any sleep over that conversation?
But I want to interfere again, just before Steve comes back.
Tell you, my position is that in the 60s and early 70s, we had an emerging movement that had begun to shake the foundations of 20th century governance in the United States. It's racist, sexist governance. And we had two responsive presidents who in various ways began to hear that and began to change. It's my contention that the politics of assassination in the 60s stopped that emerging political, social, spiritual awakening in the United States that was beginning to challenge the foundations of the ancient oppressions. So that the politics of assassination, I maintain, they were not an accident. I have moral certainty about this King assassination. I do not have the same certainty about the Kennedy assassination, the Kennedy's assassinations, because I've really not gone to do the research on them and to read and study and understand, see what I see. But I know on the King assassination, in any case, you need to understand that from a nonviolent analysis of our history, those assassinations changed the United States forever in the 20th and 21st century. Donald Trump would not be president but for those assassinations. Now, I'm put that and lay it out there. I'm not afraid to say it. The presidential politics were headed towards John and Robert Kennedy. The social political environment was beginning to embrace them. John's re-election in '64 would probably have been followed by Robert's election in '68, not Richard Nixon's. So the whole direction of presidential politics was changed. An emerging movement of justice that had begun to start the ball rolling for moving towards access, more democracy, more opportunity, was halted. I mean, after all, when a person like King is removed from a movement, when the movement itself hasn't yet has not yet understood precisely what it was about, but was moving in that direction, then the movement falls apart. And I didn't really understand that in 68, 69, 70. I do understand it now more than I did then. But it halted the movement. It allowed the varied voices within the black community to pull away from continuing the movement and continuing the learning and continuing to gain experience in direct action that could bring change. It also, from my point of view, allowed the notion to emerge that the 60s was a decade of violence, not a decade of creative awakening. So I put that out there because I think that's part of it. Now, Steve.
If this would take us too far off of a tangent from where you want to go, that's fine, and I'm perfectly willing to put it aside. We started to talk about the Constitution and the possibility of rewriting it because it does still enshrine the idea that some persons are only 3 years of a person. Another idea that I've had is that, so much of who we are as a people nationally is anchored in 2 documents. One is the Declaration of Independence and the other is the Constitution. And I wondered sometimes if we wouldn't benefit from writing a Declaration of Interdependence to kind of state clearly, just as Jefferson and company stated that we're all entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and hinted at all persons are created equal, even though the context he was writing in meant all white planters from the South. If we really more clearly stated our interdependence and our equality in a new Declaration of Interdependence and affirmed that as a people, and then rewrote our Constitution to cover some of the administrative gaps, but also to, right from the very start, affirm our equality under the law and take out the loopholes that allow people to play us against each other. Do you think that would be a productive path? Do you think it could get any traction? And again, if you think that's too far of a tangent to go from where you want to go, I'm okay with that. And I would also remind you of the 4 steps, that we only got one.
I differ with the myth that we are deeply rooted in those 2 documents. Because, just take one institution, the Supreme Court operated as though those two documents did not exist, and that they did not pertain to black people or women or people of color or poor people. So many decisions that they made in the 19th century, 20th century that said the Constitution did not include many of these issues. Now, it took the NAACP's strategy of getting the Constitution reinterpreted before we did have Supreme Courts that said that the Constitution applies to all the residents of the society, including the people who were non-citizens who resided here. That's what the battle over the Supreme Court is, because Jeff Sessions represents the Paul Ryans, the William Buckleys, who want a Supreme Court that will live with the nonsense that those documents did not pertain to all people. I differ with my founding fathers, Washington, Jefferson, and Hamilton, and others, in that they could not find the way to move the nation to let the documents abide. But I do understand that from the point of view of how acute political issues can become, so that people in the generation cannot move through it very well. And I do say to myself, at least, that I do not blame them for not being able to handle the issue of slavery. Their debates of slavery were often far more intense than any debates in Congress or White House since. We've followed that path, but the mythology that those documents have been the rule of law is what has to be questioned. They were not used to govern the society. They were not used in the 19th century to deal with the Indians, the indigenous people. The indigenous people were seen as being outside that rule of law. Well, when you operate that way in one dimension, or two dimensions, or three dimensions, or four dimensions, you created documents, yes, and they're wonderful in my judgment. They're still good documents, but you create a practical arena where you live by mythology and schizophrenia rather than by the two documents. It's only in the 20th century, the last half of the 20th century, that the Supreme Court began to include women, people of color, poor people, economic issues, the prisoner having certain basic rights still. It's only in that period of time. So that's why the Supreme Court is a major battleground. The segregationists like Jeff Sessions called the May 17, 1954 Supreme Court decision that said that equality meant equal practical application of equality, so that segregation could not be equal and was not equal and was therefore unconstitutional. See, at this moment, the battle is about having a Supreme Court that will allow us to have the two documents and to continue the mythology, we are a people of law. That's my point. And that's because of the strategy of the civil rights movement. One of the strategies was taking legal cases, taking cases of discrimination in education, in jobs and whatnot, into the federal court and challenging their constitutionality. And that has successfully created a different interpretation of the Constitution. It is that which James Dobson and Pat Robinson are continuing to fight. So I'm not sure that putting those documents on in a place where we're going to rewrite them will do it. I would much prefer, for an example, I would much prefer women movements and organizations raising a storm over the ERA amendment as a way of abolishing the discrimination, as a way of putting our ideal on record, rather than changing the Constitution per se, which is, I think, far more complicated than what our confusing society can handle. That the movement that demands the ERA as an amendment may be more helpful. Or an amendment that would say that the 3/5 of a person has now been abolished and nullified. That I think the amendment process is a better process than a constitutional process. That's my point. So I really feel I am upset and frustrated that now and women's organizations have not stormed on the issue of the ERA as an amendment, locally and nationally. And that's one of the reasons why when I teach some of these things in the university, as I do, I also teach the women's movement, especially the Ellis Paul wing of the women's movement. The Ellis Paul wing of the women's suffrage movement is the wing that became the catalyst that caused the 19th Amendment to be passed in August of 1920. But they very specifically used far more of direct action tactics. And the women's movement did not like them. They were too radical. The president of the American suffrage movement, in fact, criticized them all the time. But that radical wing of the women's movement in 1910s, 1914, 1917, is what at the grassroots level and at the national level kept the issue of the right to vote in front of the nation and did a great amount of political reawakening so that the amendment got passed in a 10-year period where it hadn't been acknowledged by the political establishment in over 100 years previously. So, all right, go ahead.
Another form of violence is violence to creation. And I don't think we have any amendment about that, do we? About caring for creation? Does anyone know, is there anything in our Constitution or an amendment about care for creation? Because the U.S. is certainly abusing creation. And that's a violence. Environmental. It's maybe something else that we should be pushing is an amendment of the environment.
Well,
Amendments and all that. I think that environmental justice is a great term that emerged in the 1980s. It's a great idea, great term, very important. It was discovered in the 1970s and 80s that much of the pollution of the soil in the United States, not agriculturally, but in terms of urban, suburban areas, the pollution of the soils where poor people and people of color lived. That was done in a UCC study in 1980, that 80% of the soil poisoning was in areas where black people lived. The paramount example of that is Louisiana and the oil pollution of the soil. And I applaud the environmental movement for putting environmental on the issue, and that is it has to be a major attack on big business that thinks that if the oil is there, it ought to be pulled up and it ought to produce wealth for me, for me and mine. So that major attack, I think, must go on. But my own personal thinking from a nonviolent perspective is that if the power brokers of the United States will not move to stop the killing of babies in the first year of life, the death of babies. 80 babies a day die in the United States in the first year of life from circumstances that have nothing to do with their parents or babies, but to the public health condition of the nation. And I maintain that if we cannot convince one another to love one another, the creation issue is never going to get established. Because the central love of creation is the love of life and the love of human beings. And so while I applaud every campaign that seeks to make a better world, I happen to think that the issue of justice for everyone, access to life, access to opportunity, is the critical issue. I am not sure I can get us to love a tree if we will not love ourselves, and if we will not love one another, and if we will not love the people who are the least of these, our brothers and sisters. I happen to think that there's a priority movement that has to be pushed hard, if I may say so.
Steve was supposed to have the floor, and you took the floor away.
The 4 steps.
Oh, the 4 steps. All right. The 4 steps that we summarize the Gandhi methodology.
And I really neglected this effort because I didn't bring any of this with me where we could have let you have copies and whatnot. Gandhi's work has been summarized by scholars in 10 methods, major methodologies. I named the parallel institution, which was number 10. I've named investigation, which from my perspective was number 1 from Gandhi. It's in much of his literature and his activist work. But in the United States, there was a keen study on the part of a small group of people, Richard Gregg, A.J. Musty, Jim Farmer, and others, Howard Thurman, Charles Walker. There were a number of people were elated by the emergence of Gandhi in the 20s and the 30s, and so proceeded to study his work and life. And so they began a relatively small debate of the Gandhian methodology. And so I inherited that conversation, and I inherited that conversations with some of them and some of their writings and lectures that I heard. So as I moved to be secretary of FOR in the South and to work with Martin King directly, I summarized the methodology in 4 steps. 1, focus instead of investigation. But investigation is a part of focus. It is doing a diligent, effective examination of where you are and what the issues are. So focus. I used the term focus. Gandhi used the term. I used the term focus instead of investigation because I think it includes the business of establishing priorities. You cannot do everything at once, and you don't want to do everything at once. So there is some issue in the study and the strategic thinking. There is some necessity of settling in on a handful or even on one tactic at a time, one target of change at a time. So focus. Focus also means using face-to-face organizing. It means preparing a public campaign. It means preparing a propaganda campaign. That is a campaign of agitation and persuasion using the Gene Sharp analysis. So it means 20 or 30 different things. So focus is the first step. But a part of the direction of focus is that you're going to carry on a campaign of direct action. So first focus, second step, negotiations. You do not need negotiations in all situations. You may need negotiations always at the end of the process rather as the second stage in the process. But the public campaign of direct action is the third step. And these steps are not 1, 2, 3, 4, but they're really much more mixed up than that. And they intermingle as a campaign goes on. So focus, negotiation, direct action campaign that gets planned under number 1 and number 2, preparation for it, very necessary, preparation for a campaign. And then then the direct action campaign. Then the fourth step that I used in Nashville and elsewhere is that of follow-up. So that in Nashville, after we got an agreement with the merchants, Kelly Miller Smith basically became the chair then of a process of following up and seeing to it that agreements were fulfilled and also focus, negotiation, direct action campaign, follow-up. These 4 are my summary of the Gandhi methodologies. And that's the 4 that I tried to apply, and the King organization, SCLC, adopted that. SNCC adopted that pretty much, as well as the way in which to go after a campaign. Yes?
Say parallel institutions?
Yeah, well, I said that last night. That's number 10 in the categories that have come out of Gandhi studies. But my focus has been been primarily on the development of nonviolent struggle, nonviolent conflict. So parallel institutions is number 10 in the Gandhian listing. And Gandhi never listed these. These are all what various ones of us and various scholars have found in reading the Gandhi material. And some other people may find more than 10. But 10 categories of methodology. Yes.
Is it possible to have a nonviolent movement in any given area, any given issue, without there first being one leader who kind of leads the pack? Memphis, Tennessee?
Absolutely.
Because there was a
No.
James Lawson.
No. Memphis happened because there were 1,300 workers with whom Jim Lawson bonded and blended and became a part of their struggle. So it would not have happened without the 1,300 people.
Of course not.
Yeah.
But you need a leader.
Well, let's say it another way. That most of the time in some of the most effective sports in terms of play, there's a need for the coach and the mentors to help do the work. Most of the time in warfare, there's a need for the military strategist who has done work on learning about war and the military and campaigns, and then being available to help people put it together. The War Department has a strategist group, and our Pentagon has done better work than any single agency in government of spotting and finding the military people who represent scholarship and research and bringing them into Washington and helping them to plan a chart of going towards PhD work and research. They've probably produced more PhD researchers in more fields than any single department of government, including FDA and National Health Institute, the National Mental Health Institute, or the Center for the Center for, what is it? Diseases, Center for Control of Diseases. They've probably done more production of researchers, PhD people, than any other department of government. They're the biggest department, of course, but they've probably proportionally done much more work. They've had for 40 or 50 years the policy of pulling into DC colonels and lieutenants and others who have good academic records and telling them to work out, and they've paid for those persons going back to Georgetown, to American University, to MIT, to Harvard, picking up graduate degrees in fields connected to the Pentagon.
Well, do you feel that there's any emerging next generation of coaches and mentors in the nonviolent area, or do you, in terms of, do you feel like it's those scholars and practitioners are going to exist generation after generation? Since there's, what's your thinking on that, or do you feel like so many of them came out of that limited time that you were working?
Well, remember
Early on that the historical classic disciplines have excluded the study of people in their reporting, the study of the arts and sciences, the study of nonviolent conflict, including the study of strikes in Europe or strikes in the United States. There are some historians now who are beginning to include that, but there is the beginning of scholars who are teaching nonviolence from its history and philosophy and methodology position. So the numbers of such scholars will grow. I've watched it grow. We didn't have any that I knew of back in 1960. But we now have any number, more than I even know about. I would refer you to names like Stephen Zunes, Z-U-N-E-S, who is a good researcher on international affairs and is a nonviolent scholar, has been for many years, teaches at University San Francisco in San Francisco. I would refer you especially to Erica Senowith, a scholar at Denver University, a young woman, maybe now in her 40s. Erica and her colleague Maria Stefan has written a book called Why Civil Resistance Works, the effectiveness of nonviolent struggle. Those two ladies, supported in part in research from different grants, including from ICNC, did a study of 323 revolutionary movements around the world from 1906 into the 21st century. Over 300 such nonviolent and violent revolutions, and then develops a whole framework for understanding how they were effective. This is the first such study that I know of history that documents the ineffectiveness of the violence. They didn't study wars, they studied what were revolutionary campaigns, nonviolent and violence. So they have produced this book that's a very, very well-read book, good book. They've gotten a lot of static in their fields of history and political science from the academic world, but history has never done this. Social science has never done this. We need such studies on the wars of America, as an example. I don't know of such a book, of such a study is going on. And they have found that the nonviolent revolutionary efforts produced better, more effective results among the people in the countries where they existed. They more readily led to the development of democratic institutions. I don't remember the percentages that they announce. But that's an example. And Erica and Maria are people who are very much committed to the research of nonviolent struggle. So we should hear more from them. So I see the numbers of scholars have already increased since 1958, 1960, and that they are pushing to make people very much aware. One of my colleagues is a woman by the name of Mary King. Mary King worked with SNCC, became a volunteer with SNCC in maybe 1962, and has since then turned her life as perhaps one of our major academic researchers. She's done some excellent work on Gandhi and various campaigns. She's done the best research on the Palestinian Intifada of the 80s. She's just now published a book doing major research, which we spent time in India doing this, in South India, on the big temple campaign that Gandhi helped to manage. She has done a major UNESCO document on King and Gandhi. That's a very fine book. It's been reissued at least once, I think, re-edited or reissued. So Mary King is another name who I have particular fondness for because she came out of the movement. She's one of the handful of people who's determined out of her experience as a young adult to become a person very much a scholar in the field. So the scholars have increased, the books have increased. So will that continue? I suspect so. I hope so. It must increase. Yes.
You know, this whole time we've been together, I've been thinking about the things that really are deeply important to me and how I can apply this to those. One is immigrant justice, and the other is, I'll say, countering white. I'm pretty deeply involved in both. Not necessarily by choice, but in one case, it's family. Immigrant justice is family. In the case, and they're linked actually, because white nationalists have been showing up at our Committee for Racial Justice and trying to shut us down. We're a group in Santa Monica that's grown out of the church in Mission Park. And Sunday before Charlottesville, 20 of the leaders of Charlottesville showed up at Virginia Avenue Park in Santa Monica to shut us down. And they didn't succeed.
They caused a great amount of interruption and
Yes.
junk in Santa Monica.
So we are, I guess by default, building a nonviolent campaign. Our next plan, our next meeting is actually going to be a family picnic in the park. So we're going to take it in a different direction. We will have a focus for the meeting, but we're kind of taking the idea of creating a celebration that isn't a reaction to, oh, they might show up necessarily, but just let's celebrate, let's get people together. And actually, a lot of people who have heard about what's going on are showing up. At one point it gets to be, well, we don't have a lot of control over their reaction to it.
Do you have a name to the organization you're working with in Santa Monica?
Yeah, it is the Committee for Racial Justice.
Ocean
Church in Ocean Park.
Church in Ocean Park. Really?
Yeah.
And it's been
Your
going,
meetings-
tell them how long it's been going. It's quite a while.
Your meetings have been being interrupted by nationalists, KKK, other people, Nazi groups.
Well, Red elephants, I don't know if you've heard that. Red elephants.
Red elephants.
Yeah, they're kind of the media wing, Proud Boys, people who are espousing neo-Nazi.
Because so the Santa Monica red groups or the
They're-
West
they're
Side
from
red groups?
Orange County.
What kind?
Red comes from Orange County. And you see them in the news, if you know who you're looking for, in Charlottesville, in Berkeley, San Francisco. They want to make Santa Monica the next Berkeley. And we're not,
You've heard that from their mouth?
well, we've seen it on their social media. That's how we know they want to shut us down. They sent out a call to their people to come. And as many people could show up. Shut us down.
So they have, you are convinced
Have systematically determined that Santa Monica is going to become another Berkeley battleground.
That's what they have said on their social media.
Uh-huh. Yes, Steve.
Yeah, you see
There.
Right.
And the headquarters too for the Dale Star is in Santa Monica.
It is bad.
Yeah, you can see it on the Southern Poverty Law Center's hate group map. It's in Santa Monica. So I'm happy, I want to connect with the community, however we can, I can bring as many people as possible that are staying.
Well, usually in these kinds of sessions, I do not try to pretend that I know precisely what has to happen in the strategies. I think local groups have to work that out for themselves. But one of the things that I would urge upon, and I've done this with a couple of the people who've talked to me about some of this, that the Committee Against Racism, is that the name of it?
Committee for Racial Justice.
Committee for Racial Justice. Yeah, I spoke with that group a long time ago, some years ago.
First keynote speaker.
Oh, okay. Well,
6 years ago.
oh, was it 6 years ago? Okay. What I would suggest is that that committee do a kind of moratorium on action. Do a kind of moratorium on action and form a major task force with the sole task of discovering what this new opposition development is and represents. Who? Examine how they have disrupted events with care. So in other words, I'm saying that you do a strategic moment where you see this opposition and you research it and investigate it yourselves. Do some face-to-face stuff. For an example, I mean by that, isolate some of the people and find out where you can reach them publicly for a private face-to-face conversations, to put that into the picture of what you're dealing with. Do some of it, but to do a thorough focus on that disruption as a potential ongoing disruption that can ruin the committee's direction. And then out of that effort, I tried to develop strategic work for the committee and then for facing the opposition. That you do not do it in some normal fashion, because that's a real challenge. And I think the black bloc, all of the people who put masks on their faces, they do not realize that they are a distraction and an interruption. They slow down the movement of people coming to terms with these matters, with themselves and all. So I strongly recommend. With the burning of the bus in Alabama in May of 1961. The FBI, the police, the White Citizens Council, the KKK, agreeing to allow a white mob to gather and beat up the bus people in Birmingham, and then again, they did it again in Montgomery. Our Nashville group was probably the only group that saw the burning bus and the mob in Birmingham as a time for us to analyze the nonviolence and the violence, what this opposition meant. And it was our group that then decided that we could not allow the burning bus or the mob action in Birmingham to stop the peaceful bus ride, freedom ride. So that's when we in Nashville, in the Nashville campaign, Nashville movement, determined that they will not stop the bus ride. We called Robert Kennedy and Martin King and Jim Farmer and I think Fred Shuttlesworth, said to them, we are recruiting volunteers now who will be on their way as fast as we can do it to Birmingham and who will get the first bus they can get to Montgomery. So that's why the bus ride went into its second phase. So strategic thinking and coming together to do the strategic work is a critical part of running short-term, long-term campaigns. So I would say the committee should say, let's not do anything for a while, and let's have weekly or bi-weekly meetings only to investigate this business. What is it? Where is it coming from? Who they are? How they're doing it? And to see if we can reach a consensus of how then we can proceed.
We've actually been doing quite a bit of that research, trying to connect with the leaders of that movement. And
No, I'm going to say to you, don't try to connect, because some of them cannot be connected with.
identify.
No, you can identify them in more ways than that. I've suggested face-to-face organizing is not about connecting. Face-to-face work is about trying to gather who this person is and what they're about and where they're coming from.
Okay, that's better.
Yeah. Face-to-face work, one-on-one. And it may take several weeks before you can get an openness so that you can get real information. I think the language of I want to connect with Jeff Sessions needs to end.
That's like a therapist saying to an alcoholic, I want to connect with you. No. Whatever that means. A therapist with an alcoholic wants to see who this alcoholic is and what happened to them, how they became an alcoholic, what the steps in their lives were, and become primarily a listener and a discoverer. If the therapist has ideas, they save the ideas until strategic moments when they bring this up as a question with the alcoholic, to help the alcoholic do their own work. So I really think that the connect stuff doesn't do the work of nonviolence.
Agreed, wrong word, but no, the listening is,
Yeah.
I would like to say a couple things. Candace is going to come and share with us what she drew together from our statements, to see if any comments on that. And after that, James, do you want to give us a few summary comments what you tried to say these 2 days, in about 5 minutes?
Not necessarily.
Think about that. I have just a couple final statements from you, and then as we go for lunch, I'd like to have us take a group picture of all of us that we can take home and show the world of this very important group we've met. So I'm wondering if we should do it before we eat or after we eat?
Probably before.
We can break before we eat.
Before the food
We
comes.
can do that, so don't go away without having a group picture. Okay, Candace, we need to hear you. Can you give us a microphone?
Oh, my.
Okay, our working titles, Reverend James Lawson, Ukaipa, August 30th, 31st, Nonviolence Transformation Retreat Team. Open to other. We are committed to research, focus, organizing, direct action, and follow-up, recognizing these as necessary steps in a successful nonviolence campaign. Like Jesus, we are athletes preparing mentally and physically for all challenges. We choose affirmative action rather than reaction or anti-action. We act from our hearts. For us, the metaphor of Jesus as solely Savior is no longer adequate. We believe we are all capable of the same love and power of Jesus. Nonviolence is love in action, is the creative force of the universe and of all humans, and is an untapped power. Knowing that we have that power of the universe within us, we choose to activate this creative force in every activity of our bodies, minds, and spirit. We reaffirm the creative practice of the transforming power of creativity in our collective and individual responses in the world. We believe nonviolence as an effective and powerful strategic methodology. We recognize the different forms of violence that we may not have previously considered acts of violence towards ourselves and others, and move to resolve those acts with love. We define and clearly communicate what nonviolence is to both ourselves and others. For us, nonviolence is a spiritual power and creative force. For us, nonviolence is a holistic way of being with ourselves and others. For us, the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus' blueprint of how the world should and can be. We believe we are created by God to do what Jesus has called us to do. We are love in action. In the face of current tensions, we embrace nonviolence as the most appropriate, loving, and effective expression of love in action. We support, choose, and express personal, political, community, and economic systems that are in alignment with nonviolence principles. We believe and honor the teachings of Jesus by activating his teachings in our lives, to love ourselves and our neighbor as ourselves. We acknowledge that a transformative nonviolent movement requires that some people are willing to suffer. To the best of our ability, we individually and collectively examine our conscience and make mindful decisions about how we can and will best step into our nonviolent action and participation.
Does anybody care to make a comment?
Or tweak any.
I move it be accepted.
Pardon?
I move it be accepted as written.
I was just going to say, could we add something to say that we acknowledge that we don't have the whole truth and that there are other religious traditions besides the Christian tradition of following Jesus that can, I don't know. Yeah.
How about something like,
I need to sit with it for a while. I need to read it. I need to go over it. I need to look at it piece by piece. I would really, I I think it's a wonderful thing. I think it's great that we all contributed to it. But I'm not going to just blanketly affirm this without taking time to really carefully consider everything said there. And, you know, before I sign that, I want to read it again and again and again. And maybe we could respond to this in the group through email and or some other method and have some more dialogue about this as they, that's my own gut reaction.
I agree.
How about, that's a good idea, I think. We do need some time to think about it. The other thing I would say is, we're probably never going to come across a document that we all agree with 100%. So we might be doing a futile effort anyway. But maybe we could adopt what we're saying, this has been adopted by the majority of the group. Not saying that everybody agrees with this.
You could also say that it's a working document.
Working document.
I would have one other question, George, and it would be a question I would ask you, because this was your idea. How would you see this used?
I see this being used as a way to share with others how exciting it is for the church and society to be thinking about nonviolence. To share with news media, newsletters, and let them know what a group of people have come up with after listening to James Lawson. Because we can't all go around and visit all these places, but we could share it on an email. And say, if you're interested, here is what we came up with after 2 days with James Lawson. I could say it's not the final answer. Others may have other ways, but this is what this group seemed to come up with after 2 days.
So George, I just put out there that, I'm just gonna put out to the group that, for me, it's more experiential. This is not something that can necessarily translate in just a statement. It's more community of people, you know, Dr. Lawson, as far as I'm concerned, is a living part of history, you know, and so I'm not sure a statement will convey all that this means.
Very good. You're very free not to use the statement at all. You don't like it, you don't think it's helpful, you've got a better way, so just accept this and count it off. You don't have to accept it. We don't add all your names to it, we'll just say a group of people who will gather together, get some of these responses to James Lawson. Okay? James, why don't you just give us
But
a...
I hear the same, it's a good summary, lots
Going on, but that we had in the 2 days. But I have problems with the church and Christianity. I have problems with the church and Christianity not recognizing that
the Lord of hosts, the God of gods, is the God at work in Islam and Hinduism and what we call the secular world and in science and whatnot. And so I have problems with conversations with religious institutions that have not really yet determined that if God is, then for many other directions of discipline and work in our long history and journey has come truth that makes where I am as a follower of Jesus only one facet of that. So the interfaith effort, Gandhi felt that the religions of the world would lead the way, working together on issues of justice, dismantling violence, and working together on feeding the hungry and helping villages to become independent ecosystems. I'll use that word. He was convinced that the way forward was for the religions of the world to stop blessing war and cruelty and violence and the destruction. That would be the best way. So many missionaries, even from my own denomination, were adamant in opposing Gandhi. Because Gandhi said that proselytizing was not the way